Now we're going to talk about step 2. Who are your students? So as we look at step 2, things that we want to consider. We want to consider, what do you expect or assume that your students will be able to do when they walk into your classroom on that particular skill statement? And then the second thing is, what are they actually able to do on that skill statement? So let's look at this a little bit deeper. What you're going to begin doing is building the initial skills profile. That is where students are when they come into your classroom. So on the initial skills profile, what you're looking at here is you're looking at your typical students. Where are the majority of your students on that skill when they come into your classroom? So once you have described that on the particular skill, then you're going to look at your well above typical, your well below typical, your most challenged student. You're going to look at above typical. Those are your strong students. And then look at below typical, a struggling student. You will then have these 5 descriptors where students will fall into one of these areas based on where they are when they come into your classroom at the beginning of the school year. So now what we're going to do is look at an initial skills profile, and we're using a swimming example because it is a neutral example. It's a non-academic sample, but I think it helps to illustrate where you will put kids and how this will make sense. So the skill statement is, students will be able to use proper breathing techniques when swimming and continue a forward motion as they take a breath. So kind of start to think about kids that are coming into a beginning swim class. So a lot of people find that it's easier to start with the typical, kind of start with the middle. Most of the students coming into a beginning swim class should be able to do this. Then we want to look at the well above typical. Most skilled students, as they come into a beginning swim class, can do these things. And then at the lowest level, where students would be. Okay? So as we look more into this example, kind of think about the idea of finding where students are in each of these levels. Okay? So, using the swimming example, from a swim coach's perspective, we know that we want students to be proficient swimmers and to master many strokes as they grow in their ability to be a good swimmer. That there's many components that go into this. So, general water safety, arm strokes, leg kicks, different breathing techniques that students must know, diving into the pool, and then doing flip turns so they can do multiple laps once they get to an advanced level. So when we think about these different components, we realize that young swimmers, often the biggest hurdle is putting their face in the water and learning how to breathe in the water. So as a swim coach would be thinking, they might think that many young swimmers are hesitant about this, just kind of based on the swim coach's experience. It might even be scary at first, but learning a proper breathing technique in the water is both essential as far as swim safety and understanding how to be a good swimmer. So it is something that is a lifelong skill as students learn to swim. Okay. So the swim coach might say, you know, the last few years I've taught beginning swimmers, and I've realized that they've really struggled with putting their face in the water. So that is something that I need to teach all students to make sure that they are learning and being able to do that. So for a beginning swim class, students come into the class wide range of techniques and abilities. So the teacher's going to base their expectations on that. So they might say that their typical students are able to be splashed in the face, maybe put their face in the water, whereas well above typical student, they might be able to hold their breath underwater. And their lowest level student might be able to stand and walk in the water. So now let's look at this more from an academic standpoint. So the skill focus is students are able to design and complete experiments and report their findings, providing supporting evidence from their data and using graphic displays to convey meaning. So a typical student looking at this skill statement could be described as a student is able to follow directions to complete an experiment with assistance from the teacher and answer a series of questions about the outcome of the experiment accurately most of the time. So think about beginning of the year. A typical student should come in being able to follow directions with teacher assistant, answer questions accurately most of the time because they have learned this in prior grades, and so this is something most students should be able to do in related to the skill focus statement. So once you have your skill focus statement down, now you might be thinking, okay, well now what? You talked about the typical level, above typical, well below, all those 5 areas. Now what we have to do is figure out how kids are going to be identified in each of those 5 areas. So there has to be some kind of measure that demonstrates where students are. We can't just make a guess and hope we put kids in the right area. There has to be something that tells us where they are. So here's just a really easy example that I think makes a lot of sense. So this was from a science teacher, and at the beginning of the year, the science teacher said, okay, there's going to be 3 measures, and kids can get either a 1, a 2, or a 3. A 1 with minimal effort, a 2 if they're on target to complete the task, and a 3 if they are very accomplished. So the 3 things the science teacher wanted to measure them on, looking at their ability to work in a lab setting, is independence, accuracy in responding to the questions, and their ability to draw conclusions. So this is what that might look like for this science teacher. He walked around as students were doing lab experiments, and then he ranked them a 1, 2, or a 3 in each of these areas of independence, accuracy, and drawing conclusions. So just a couple of examples. Ginger. She got a 3, a 3, and a 3. That was the highest possible score she could get. So she's considered well above typical. She got 9 out of 9. So here we have Dolores, who got 7 out of 9. Did pretty well, had a good understanding, good ability to work independently, had good accuracy, and could draw conclusions. So 7 out of 9 put her in the typical range. Then Lamar got 8 out of 9. So he was considered above typical. So I hope this allows you to see some kind of measure has to be incorporated in order to identify students in each of those 5 descriptor levels on the initial skills profile. And this was just an example, something that didn't take a lot of time, but it did provide valuable information to the teacher. So now what we're going to do is stop and look at step 2. This is where you are going to create your initial skill profile for your students. So at the top, you're going to identify the SLO skill focus that you've already did in step 1. And then you're going to begin describing what each of these 5 areas look like for your students when they come into your classroom. At this time, also be thinking about how are you going to measure where students are. Also, it's important to keep in mind that These descriptors are for your class. These are the students that are coming in for you. So it may not be the same from teacher to teacher. So I think that that is important to look at. So if you will take some time and begin working on step 2, parts A, B, and C of the initial skills profile.